I went to my lake house after months abroad and found strangers living there, my son, his wife, and her parents. She screamed, "You have no right to be here." I smiled and said, "Funny. I built this place with my own hands." Her father grabbed the phone, shouting he'd call the cops. I leaned against the doorframe and said, "Do it. Let's see whose name they find on the deed." Then I poured myself a drink and waited. What happened next silenced them all. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My hands trembled as I turned the key in the lock, the familiar weight of it feeling foreign after 3 months abroad. The lake house stood before me, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, but something was wrong. Very wrong. The windows that should have been dark were glowing with warm light. Voices drifted from inside, laughter that didn't belong to me. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pushed open the door I had built with my own hands 27 years ago. What the hell? The voice belonged to a woman I barely recognized as my daughter-in-law, Sadie. She stood in my living room wearing my late wife Margaret's reading glasses, holding what looked like a legal document. Behind her, a man I'd never seen before sat in Margaret's favorite armchair like he owned the place. "You have no right to be here," Sadie shrieked, her face flushing red as she pointed an accusatory finger at me. The audacity of it knocked the breath from my lungs. This was my house. Every board, every nail, every carefully chosen stone of the fireplace had been placed by these weathered hands. I looked past her to see my son Michael emerging from what used to be my bedroom. 28 years old, standing there like I was the intruder, the boy I'd taught to fish in these very waters, who'd helped me sand these floors when he was 12, now stared at me with cold, unfamiliar eyes. "Dad." His voice was flat, emotionless. "We weren't expecting you back so soon." The words hit me like a physical blow. Weren't expecting me back to my own home? I set my suitcase down slowly, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The walls that once held photographs of our family vacations, of Margaret's garden, of Michael's graduation, were now covered with generic artwork. Our personal touches, the memories we'd built here, had been erased. "Michael," I said, my voice hoarse with shock, "what's going on here?" Before he could answer, the stranger in Margaret's chair stood up. He was tall, probably in his 60s, with the kind of entitled posture that screamed money and arrogance. "I'm Robert Kellerman," he announced, extending his hand like we were meeting at some social function. "Sadie's father. I think there's been some confusion here." I didn't take his hand. Instead, I looked around my transformed living room. The rustic coffee table Margaret and I had bought at an antique fair in Vermont was gone, replaced by some modern glass monstrosity. The quilts her mother had sewn were nowhere to be seen. Even the smell was wrong. Instead of the cedar and lake air that had always defined this place, there was an artificial floral scent that made my stomach turn. "Where's my wife's piano?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The baby grand that Margaret had played every evening, where she'd taught Michael his first songs, had vanished. In its place sat a flat-screen television the size of a small wall. Sadie exchanged a glance with her father. "Michael said you'd gotten rid of all that old stuff, said you wanted to modernize." The lie was so brazen, so completely fabricated that I actually laughed. A short, bitter sound that seemed to echo off the walls. I said, "What?" "You've been gone for months," Michael said, his voice defensive but lacking conviction. "We figured you weren't coming back. Sadie thought she could move her entire family into my house?" I interrupted, feeling a dangerous calm settle over me. This was worse than theft. This was erasure. A woman appeared from the kitchen, clearly Sadie's mother, sharing the same sharp features and calculating eyes. She wiped her hands on a dish towel that had once belonged to Margaret. "Dennis, isn't it? Sadie's told us so much about you. We're just helping Michael take care of the place while you were traveling." "Take care of the place." I looked at the scratches on the hardwood floors, the water rings on surfaces that had been pristine when I left. Through the window I could see the deck I'd built by hand was now cluttered with patio furniture I'd never seen before, and there was a hot tub where Margaret's herb garden used to bloom. "You built a hot tub?" I said slowly. "In my wife's garden." Sadie lifted her chin defiantly. "That old garden was just weeds anyway. We've improved this place, made it actually livable, modern." The rage that swept through me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Margaret had spent 15 years cultivating that garden. She'd planted herbs and flowers that would bloom in sequence from spring through fall, creating a living calendar of color and fragrance. She died in that garden, sitting on the bench I'd built for her, watching the sunset over the lake one last time. "Get out," I said quietly. "Excuse me?" Robert Kellerman stepped forward, his chest puffed out like a rooster. "Now, see here, Dennis. I don't think you understand the situation. Michael and Sadie have been living here for months. They've made improvements, investments. You can't just get out of my house." My voice was steady now, ice cold. "All of you." Sadie's father grabbed his phone from the coffee table. "I'm calling the police. This is harassment. We have rights here." I smiled then, and it must have been a terrible thing to see, because even Michael took a step back. "Do it," said, leaning against the doorframe I'd measured and cut myself. "Let's see whose name they find on the deed." As Robert dialed, I walked slowly through my violated home. In the kitchen, they'd replaced Margaret's vintage stove with some chrome monstrosity. The refrigerator was covered with photos of strangers, Sadie's family, her friends, people who had no connection to this place that Margaret and I had poured our souls into building. I opened the refrigerator and pulled out a beer. My beer, from a case I'd left before traveling. I popped it open and took a long, deliberate sip, watching as Sadie's family huddled together, whispering frantically. "The police are on their way," Robert announced triumphantly. "Good," I replied, settling into what had been my reading chair, but was now positioned wrong, facing away from the window that overlooked the lake. "I have so much to tell them." The confidence on their faces began to waver. Sadie bit her lip, a tell I'd noticed in the few family gatherings where she'd actually shown up. Michael stood frozen, caught between his father and his wife, and for the first time since I'd walked in, I saw a flicker of the boy I'd raised. "Dad," he started, "maybe we should talk about this privately." "Oh, we'll talk," I assured him, taking another sip of my beer. "We're going to talk about a lot of things, but first I want to hear what you tell the police about how you ended up living in a house that belongs to someone else." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of gravel crunching in the driveway. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows as the police arrived to sort out what would turn out to be much more complicated than anyone, except me, had imagined. The police officers listened to everyone's story with the practiced patience of people who'd seen family disputes before, but I could tell they were puzzled. When they asked for identification and proof of residence, I handed over my driver's license with this address and the property deed from my glove compartment. Sadie's family had nothing but excuses and anger. "We'll need to sort this out at the station," the older officer said diplomatically, but his eyes told the real story. He knew who belonged here and who didn't. After they left with promises to investigate further, the house fell into an uncomfortable silence. Michael stood by the window staring out at the lake, while Sadie and her parents whispered furiously in the corner. I used the quiet to really look at what they'd done to my home. It wasn't just the big changes, the missing piano, the destroyed garden. It was the small violations that cut deepest. Margaret's cookbook collection, recipes she'd handwritten in the margins, was gone from the kitchen shelves. The throw pillows she'd embroidered with lake scenes had been replaced with stark, modern cushions that looked like they belonged in a doctor's office. I walked to the mantelpiece where our wedding photo used to sit in a place of honor. Instead, there was a generic candle and a picture of Sadie's parents at some resort vacation. 29 years of marriage reduced to empty space. "Where are the photo albums?" I asked, my voice cutting through their whispered conference. Sadie looked up defiant. "We put them in storage. They were cluttering up the place." "Storage?" I repeated the word like it was foreign. "You put my wife's memories in storage." "They were old pictures, Dennis," her mother chimed in with fake sympathy. "You can't live in the past forever. Michael said you'd been having trouble letting go since Margaret passed." I turned to my son, feeling something crack inside my chest. I've been having trouble letting go. Michael's shoulders hunched, the way they used to when he was a teenager caught in a lie. Dad, you know what Dr. Peterson said about grief, about how keeping all those reminders around wasn't healthy. Dr. Peterson. I'd never heard of any Dr. Peterson, but I could see from Michael's face that this was part of some elaborate story they'd constructed. A narrative where I was the broken old man who couldn't function, who needed his family to make decisions for him. Tell me more about Dr. Peterson, I said calmly, sitting down in my own living room like a guest. Sadie and her mother exchanged glances. Michael shifted uncomfortably. He's a grief counselor, Michael said finally. Someone Sadie found. He said that sometimes family members need to step in when someone can't move forward on their own. And this Dr. Peterson told you to move into my house? We didn't move in, Sadie protested. We're house-sitting, taking care of things while you traveled and got your head straight. Michael was worried about you being alone here with all these memories. The story was taking shape now, and it was masterful in its cruelty. They'd painted me as a grief-stricken old man who couldn't take care of himself or his property. Poor Dennis living in the past, surrounded by painful reminders of his dead wife. Good thing his son and daughter-in-law were there to help him heal by erasing every trace of the woman he'd loved for 3 decades. When did this intervention begin? I asked. Right after you left for Europe, Michael said. Sadie thought it would be good to surprise you when you got back. Show you how nice the place could look without all the... Without all the what, son? He couldn't finish the sentence. Even he knew how it sounded. The clutter, Sadie finished for him. All those old things that were just making you sad. I stood up slowly, my joints protesting after the long flight, and walked to where the piano used to be. Margaret had played it every evening after dinner, her fingers finding melodies that turned our house into a home. Sometimes Michael would sing along, his young voice harmonizing with hers, in a way that made my heart swell with pride. Do you remember, I said to Michael, not turning, around, how your mother used to play Danny Boy every year on your birthday? How she'd get tears in her eyes because you were growing up so fast? I heard him take a shaky breath. Dad, do you remember how she taught you to play chopsticks on that piano? How proud she was when you finally got the timing right? That's exactly what we're talking about, Sadie interrupted sharply. This obsession with the past. It's not healthy, Dennis. Michael's been worried sick about you. I turned around then, and I must have looked different because Michael actually stepped back. How long? I asked quietly. Have you been telling my son that loving his mother's memory is an obsession? Sadie's face flushed red. I never said that. How long have you been convincing him that this house, the home his parents built together, was somehow unhealthy for me to live in? You're twisting everything around, her father interjected. We're trying to help here. Michael said you hadn't been taking care of yourself, that you were drinking too much, staying up all night looking at old photos. Another lie, expertly crafted. I'd never been much of a drinker, and the few photos I'd looked at brought me comfort, not pain. But I could see how the story would sound to outsiders, how it would justify their invasion of my life. Michael, I said, ignoring the others completely, look at me. He raised his eyes reluctantly, and for a moment I saw the boy I'd raised, the kid who'd helped me build this deck, who'd learned to drive on the winding road that led to town, who'd brought Margaret wildflowers from the meadow every Mother's Day. Do you really believe that I can't take care of myself? His mouth opened, but no words came out. Do you really believe that remembering your mother, keeping her things, honoring her memory is unhealthy? Tears started in his eyes. Sadie said... I don't care what Sadie said. My voice was firm but not harsh. I'm asking what you believe. In your heart, when you think about the man who raised you, who taught you to fish and drive and stand up for what's right, do you really think I've lost my mind? The silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. Then Sadie stepped between us, her face twisted with an expression I'd never seen before, raw, desperate anger. This is exactly the problem, she snarled. This manipulation. You guilt-trip him with memories, make him feel bad for trying to move forward with his life. Michael has been trying to honor his mother's memory by taking care of you, and you're making him feel guilty for it." The words hung in the air like smoke, revealing everything. This wasn't about grief counseling or house-sitting or helping me heal. This was about control, about rewriting the narrative of our family so that Michael would doubt his own memories, his own judgment, his own father. I looked at my son, standing there torn between the woman he'd married and the man who'd raised him, and I realized that tomorrow, when I started fighting back, it wasn't just about the house or the piano or Margaret's garden. It was about saving my son from the woman who was systematically destroying everything he'd ever known about love, family, and truth. That night, I slept in the guest room of my own house. The master bedroom had been completely transformed, Margaret's antique vanity replaced with some modern monstrosity, our wedding quilt bundled away somewhere, the walls painted a cold gray that made the room feel like a hotel. I couldn't bear to stay in there, not when every familiar comfort had been stripped away, but I didn't sleep much. Instead, I lay awake, planning, thinking about the conversation I'd had with my lawyer from Europe just 2 weeks ago. Thomas Hartwell had been handling my affairs for over 20 years, and when I'd called him about updating my will during my travels, he'd mentioned something interesting about home security systems and their legal implications. At 6 in the morning, I made coffee in my own kitchen using a machine I'd never seen before. Apparently, my old percolator had been another casualty of the modernization. Sadie's family was still asleep, sprawled across my home like they owned it, but I could hear Michael moving around upstairs. He came down 20 minutes later, looking like he hadn't slept either. His hair was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone trying not to wake sleeping tigers. "Dad," he said quietly, "we need to talk." I nodded toward the deck. Outside. We sat on the furniture they'd bought, cheap aluminum chairs that would rust in a season, and looked out over the lake that had been the backdrop of his childhood. The morning mist was rising off the water, and for a moment it felt like old times, before Sadie, before the lies, before everything went wrong. "I know this looks bad," Michael began, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "It looks like my son let strangers destroy his parents' home," I said simply. He flinched. "They're not strangers, Dad. They're family now." "Are they?" I asked. "Tell me, Michael, what do you know about your wife's family? Really know?" His jaw tightened. "I know they've been nothing but supportive. When Sadie and I were struggling financially, they helped us out. When you started having problems after Mom died—" "Stop!" I held up a hand. "What problems? Be specific." Michael stared at the lake, unable to meet my eyes. "You know, the drinking, the way you'd sit in the dark looking at photo albums. Sadie said she found you talking to Mom's picture one night, crying." Every word was a lie, carefully crafted and delivered with enough detail to be believable. I'd never had a drinking problem, barely touched alcohol except for an occasional beer. I'd never sat in the dark with photo albums, and I'd certainly never had some breakdown where Sadie found me crying. But I could see how it would work. A grief-stricken widower, living alone in a house full of memories, gradually losing his grip on reality. His concerned daughter-in-law, worried about his mental health, convincing his son that intervention was necessary. "Michael," I said carefully, "when exactly did Sadie witness these episodes?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know the specific dates, but was I here when she saw me talking to your mother's picture?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, was I physically present in this house when your wife claims to have witnessed my breakdown?" The question hung between us like a trap, waiting to be sprung. Michael's face went pale as the implications hit him. "Because," I continued, "I've been traveling for 3 months. Before that, I was in Chicago for 2 weeks settling your grandmother's estate. And before that, I was in Boston visiting your uncle for a month. So when exactly did Sadie witness my deteriorating mental state?" Michael's mouth opened and closed without making a sound. "There's something else you should know," I said, pulling out my phone. "Something I haven't told anyone." I scrolled through the apps until I found the one I was looking for. The security system I'd installed the year after Margaret died, when the insurance company offered a discount for monitored homes. It was discreet, professional, and most importantly, it recorded everything. "Dad, what is that?" "Security cameras," I said simply. "Installed 18 months ago, motion-activated, cloud storage, the works. I never mentioned them because I never thought I'd need them." The color drained completely from Michael's face. "You've been recording us?" "I've been recording everyone who enters my property," I corrected. "It's all perfectly legal. Thomas checked the statutes. And let me tell you, son, the footage from the past 3 months has been very illuminating." I opened the app and scrolled back to a date 6 weeks ago. The video was crystal clear. Sadie and her parents loading a truck with furniture from the house. Margaret's rocking chair, the one where she'd nursed Michael as a baby, being carried out like garbage. The antique dining set we'd inherited from my parents, loaded into a moving van. "This is from August 15th, I said, showing him the screen. "Want to guess where your mother's piano ended up?" Michael stared at the video, watching his wife directing strangers to remove pieces of his childhood. His hands were shaking now. "There's more," I said, swiping to another video. "This one's from last week. Recognize the people?" The footage showed a party in full swing. Strangers drinking and laughing in our living room, couples making out on the couch where Michael had once fallen asleep watching cartoons, someone smoking marijuana on the deck I'd built with my own hands. "Sadie threw a party," Michael whispered. "3 parties, actually. Want to see the one where someone broke your mother's china cabinet?" I watched my son's face crumble as the reality hit him. This wasn't house-sitting. This wasn't helping a grief-stricken father-in-law heal. This was theft, plain and simple, dressed up in the language of concern and family intervention. "The piano?" he asked quietly. I scrolled to another video. "Sold it to an antique dealer for $1,200. Cash transaction. Your mother's Steinway baby grand, bought for our 5th anniversary, sold like it was a garage sale item." Michael put his head in his hands. "Oh, God. Dad, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "I believe you," I said, and I meant it. "But Michael, you need to understand something. This isn't just about furniture or money. This is about who your wife really is." The sliding door opened behind us and Sadie appeared, wrapped in one of Margaret's robes, another small violation that made my jaw clench. She'd clearly been listening because her face was tight with barely controlled panic. "Good morning, honey," she said to Michael, but her eyes were fixed on my phone. "What are you two talking about so early?" Michael looked up at her, and I saw something I hadn't seen in months. Doubt. Real, genuine doubt about the woman he'd married. "We're talking about piano sales," I said pleasantly, "and party planning and the fascinating world of home security technology." Sadie's face went white. Behind her I could see her parents hovering in the doorway, trying to hear without being obvious about it. "I think," I continued, standing up slowly, "it's time we all had a real conversation about what's been happening in my house. Don't you agree, Sadie?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since I'd known her, my daughter-in-law was completely speechless, and that's when I knew I had her. The living room felt like a courtroom as we all gathered around the glass coffee table that had replaced Margaret's handcrafted oak piece. Sadie sat rigidly next to Michael, her parents flanking them like bodyguards. I settled into my reading chair, my phone in my lap, feeling strangely calm for a man whose entire life had been turned upside down. "Before we begin," I said, looking directly at Robert Kellerman, "I think you should know that everything we're about to discuss is being recorded by the security system for legal purposes." Robert's confident demeanor faltered slightly. "Legal purposes?" "Property theft, fraud, potentially elder abuse," I said matter-of-factly. "My lawyer assures me we have quite a case building." Sadie's mother, Linda, leaned forward with fake concern. "Dennis, honey, I think you're confused. We haven't stolen anything. We've been taking care of your home." I smiled and opened another video on my phone. This one showed her going through Margaret's jewelry box, holding up pieces to the light, examining them like an appraiser. "Taking care of it?" Is that what you call this? The video was damning. Linda picking through necklaces and bracelets, setting aside the more expensive pieces, photographing them with her phone. In the background, Sadie could be seen doing the same thing with Margaret's books, apparently checking their value online. We were just cataloging things, Linda stammered, for insurance purposes. Whose insurance? I asked. Mine. Because I never asked for an inventory. Or perhaps you meant your own insurance, making sure you knew what was worth stealing before you took it. Michael stared at the screen, watching his wife and mother-in-law systematically evaluate his mother's possessions like vultures picking over a carcass. His face had gone gray. "This is ridiculous," Sadie finally exploded. "You're making us sound like criminals. We were helping you, Dennis. You were falling apart, living in the past, and Michael was worried sick." "Show them the documents," Robert said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him. "Show him the papers, Sadie, the ones from Dr. Peterson." Sadie shot her father a warning look, but he was already reaching into a briefcase I hadn't noticed before. He pulled out a manila folder and slapped it on the table with theatrical flair. "Dr. Andrew Peterson, licensed clinical psychologist," Robert announced. He evaluated Dennis's mental state based on Michael's reports and recommended immediate family intervention. I picked up the folder and flipped through it. Professional letterhead, official-looking signatures, detailed psychological assessment. According to these documents, I was suffering from severe depression, alcohol dependency, and early-stage dementia. The recommendation was clear. I was mentally incompetent and needed family members to make decisions on my behalf. "Interesting," I said, setting the papers down. "Very thorough work. Must have cost quite a bit to have these fabricated." "They're not fabricated," Sadie protested. "Dr. Peterson is a real doctor. We can give you his number." "Oh, I'm sure you can," I agreed. "I'm also sure that if I call that number, I'll reach someone who's been paid to play a role. What I'm curious about is how Dr. Peterson managed to evaluate my mental state without ever meeting me." The silence that followed was deafening. "The assessment was based on Michael's detailed reports," Linda said quickly. "Sometimes preliminary evaluations can be done remotely when there's sufficient family testimony." "Michael's detailed reports," I repeated, turning to my son. "Tell me, Michael, when did you compile these detailed reports about my mental deterioration?" Michael looked like he wanted to disappear into the couch. "Sadie helped me write them. She said I was too close to the situation to see clearly." "So Sadie wrote reports about my mental state, signed your name to them, and had them evaluated by a psychologist you've never met?" "It's more complicated than that," Sadie said desperately. "Actually, it's quite simple," I said, pulling out my phone. Again. "Because I have security footage of you, Sadie, meeting with a man in a cheap suit who handed you these documents in exchange for a cash payment. $2,000 to be exact." The lie rolled off my tongue so smoothly that even I almost believed it. But the effect was immediate and devastating. Sadie's face went white, her mother gasped, and Robert started blustering about proof and evidence. Most importantly, Michael stared at his wife with growing horror. "Sadie, is that true?" "Of course it's not true," she snapped, but there was panic in her voice now. "He's making it up to turn you against me." "Am I?" I asked, standing up slowly. "Michael, let me ask you something. In all the years you've known me, have you ever known me to lie to you about something important?" Michael shook his head slowly. "Have you ever known me to have a drinking problem?" Another shake. "Have you ever seen me talk to your mother's photograph or have any kind of breakdown?" "No," Michael whispered. "But you believed I had all these problems because your wife told you I did?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. I could see Michael's mind working, remembering conversations, reassessing moments, realizing how many of his concerns about my mental health had originated with Sadie. "She was worried about you," he said weakly, but even he didn't sound convinced anymore. "Was she?" I asked, "or was she worried about something else entirely?" I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a document I'd been carrying since my return from Europe. Thomas Hartwell had faxed it to my hotel in London after our phone conversation about will updates. This, I said, unfolding the paper, is a property search that Sadie conducted 3 weeks ago. She was checking the current market value of this house and investigating the process for transferring property titles in cases of mental incompetency. The document was real, though I'd only discovered it through Thomas's connections at the county clerk's office. Sadie had indeed been researching property transfers, armed with what she thought were legitimate psychological evaluations of my mental state. Michael grabbed the paper, his hands shaking as he read. "You were trying to take the house?" "I was trying to help you," Sadie shrieked. "Your father was going to drink himself to death in this mausoleum. At least this way you'd have something to show for it." The mask was finally slipping. All the concern, all the worry about my mental health, all the talk about helping me heal, it had been about money, about getting control of a lakefront property worth close to $800,000. "You never loved this place," Michael said quietly, looking around the transformed room. "You hated it from the first time I brought you here." "Because it's a shrine to a dead woman," Sadie exploded. "Every surface covered with pictures, every conversation about what your precious mother would have wanted. I was trying to give you a future instead of trapping you in the past." The honesty was brutal and revealing. This wasn't about my mental health or Michael's well-being. This was about a woman who resented her husband's love for his deceased mother and saw an opportunity to erase that love while enriching herself in the process. Michael stood up slowly, his face a mask of disgust and disbelief. "You sold my mother's piano. It was just taking up space. You threw parties in my father's house while he was grieving abroad. Michael, honey, you're not seeing the big picture. You tried to have my father declared mentally incompetent so you could steal his home." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of consequence that would never stop spreading. And in that moment I knew I had won more than just a house back. I had won my son. The silence that followed Michael's accusation was broken by the sound of Sadie's phone buzzing. She glanced at it reflexively, and I caught a glimpse of panic in her eyes before she quickly turned it face down. "That's probably your lawyer," I said conversationally. "The one who's been helping you navigate the property transfer process." Sadie's face went ashen. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do," I said, settling back in my chair with the calm of a man who held all the cards. "Just like you know about the storage unit you rented to hold my wife's belongings, unit number 47 at Secure Store on Highway 9, rented under your maiden name, Kellerman." The gasp from Linda was audible. Even Robert looked shocked, though I couldn't tell if it was because he didn't know about the storage unit or because he couldn't believe I'd found out about it. "You've been very thorough, Sadie," I continued, "very organized, almost everything that made this house a home, carefully packed away and stored. I imagine you were planning to sell it all once you'd successfully had me declared incompetent." Michael stood frozen in the middle of the room, looking from his wife to me like a man watching a tennis match where the stakes were his entire understanding of reality. "The piano was just the beginning, wasn't it?" I asked. "Test the waters, see if anyone would notice. When that went smoothly, you got bolder. The furniture, the photographs, the books, even Margaret's wedding dress." That last detail hit Michael like a physical blow. "Mom's wedding dress?" "Stored away with everything else," I confirmed. "Along with her jewelry, her china, her recipe collection, everything that connected this house to the woman who made it a home." Sadie was shaking now, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. "You don't understand. This place was like a museum. It wasn't healthy for anyone to live surrounded by all those memories." "Whose decision was that to make?" I asked quietly. "Someone had to make it," she exploded. "Michael was never going to stand up to you. He was going to let you turn him into another widowed old man, living in the past, never moving forward. I was trying to save him from becoming you." The words hung in the air like a slap. In her desperation, Sadie had revealed exactly what she thought of the life Margaret and I had built, the love we'd shared, the grief I'd carried with dignity and grace. "I see," I said softly, and the best way to save him from becoming like me was to steal his inheritance? It's not stealing if it's going to be his anyway. Eventually, yes, I agreed, but not yet, and certainly not under the circumstances you had planned. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope that had been waiting for this moment. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, with the letterhead of Hartwell and Associates at the top. "There's something none of you know," I said, opening the envelope slowly. "Something Margaret and I arranged years ago, but that I've never shared with Michael." Michael's eyes fixed on the document in my hands. "Dad, what is that?" "Your mother's will," I said simply. "Her private will, separate from our joint estate planning. She was very specific about certain things she wanted to leave to you, but only under particular circumstances." The room went dead silent. Even the lake outside seemed to have stopped moving. "Margaret was a wise woman," I continued, unfolding the document. "She worried that someday you might marry someone who didn't understand the value of family history, family tradition, someone who might try to erase the memory of your childhood, your mother's love, the foundation she and I tried to build for you." Sadie was staring at the will like it was a snake about to strike. "So she created what's called a moral clause," I explained. "The lake house, which was always intended to be yours eventually, would only transfer to you if you demonstrated that you shared her values about family, respect, and honoring the past while building the future." Michael's voice was barely a whisper. "What kind of demonstration?" "Very simple, really," I said, looking directly at Sadie. "You had to show that you would protect and preserve family memories, not destroy them. You had to prove that you understood the difference between moving forward and erasing the past." I pulled out another document, this one with official court seals and notarized signatures. "This is a detailed inventory of everything that was in this house when I left for Europe. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every book. Margaret's will specifies that if these items were removed, sold, or destroyed by you or your spouse, the inheritance would be forfeit." The color drained from Michael's face as the implications hit him. "Everything Sadie removed violates the terms of your mother's bequest," I confirmed. "The piano alone would have been enough to trigger the clause, but the systematic removal of family photos, the storage of personal effects, the parties, the general disrespect for what this place represented to your mother, it's far beyond what even she anticipated in her worst fears." Sadie was on her feet now, her voice rising to a shriek. "This is insane. You can't punish Michael for my decisions. He didn't know about any of this." "Actually," I said, pulling out yet another document, "Margaret anticipated that possibility too. The will makes provisions for cases where a spouse might be manipulated or misled by their partner." Michael stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the papers in my hands. "What provisions?" "If you can demonstrate that you were acting under false information, if you can show that your wife deliberately deceived you about my mental state, my needs, or my wishes, then you have 30 days to restore everything to its original condition and make amends for the damage done." The silence that followed was profound. I could practically hear the wheels turning in everyone's heads as they processed what this meant. "However," I continued, my voice growing serious, "if you choose to stand by your wife's actions, if you defend what she's done or refuse to make restitution, then you forfeit not just the house, but any claim to anything that was your mother's." Sadie was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage and frustration. "This is manipulation. This is emotional blackmail." "No," I said quietly. "This is exactly what your mother feared would happen, Michael. She saw this coming 20 years before you even met Sadie." I handed him the will, watching as he read his mother's words, her hopes for his future, her fears about what might happen to the family they'd built, her love for him expressed in careful legal language designed to protect him from exactly the situation he now found himself in. "She knew," Michael whispered, tears starting in his eyes. "She knew someone might try to erase her." "Your mother was many things," I said softly, "but naive wasn't one of them. She understood that love and memory are fragile things easily destroyed by people who don't value them." Michael looked up at me, then at Sadie, then back at the will in his hands. The choice before him was stark and simple: his mother's legacy or his wife's greed. And for the first time in months I saw my son clearly, not the confused, manipulated man who'd been living in my house, but the boy Margaret and I had raised to know the difference between right and wrong. The boy who would never choose money over memory or convenience over love. The boy who was about to make the hardest decision of his life. Michael stood in the center of the living room, Margaret's will trembling in his hands, tears streaming down his face as he read his mother's words. The woman who had raised him, who had sung him to sleep and taught him to be a good man, had reached from beyond the grave to save him from his own mistakes. She wrote this after my first date with Sadie, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Look at the date. I glanced at the document. Margaret had updated her will 3 weeks after Michael brought Sadie home for dinner, the night she'd pulled me aside and whispered, "Something about that girl doesn't sit right with me, Dennis. She looks at our things like she's appraising them." "Your mother was always a good judge of character," I said gently. Sadie made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Michael, honey, you can't let them manipulate you like this. Your mother is dead. I'm your wife. I'm here. I'm real. I love you." Michael looked up at her, his face calm for the first time since I'd returned home. "Do you? Do you love me?" "Of course I do." "Then why did you try to have my father declared mentally incompetent?" "To help him. To steal his house," Michael corrected. "Why did you sell my mother's piano?" "It was just taking up space. It was the first thing she taught me to play. Why did you throw parties here while he was grieving alone in Europe?" Sadie's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "Why," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger, "did you spend our entire marriage trying to erase every trace of the woman who raised me?" "Because I was tired of competing with a ghost," Sadie finally screamed. "Every conversation, every decision, every plan we made had to be filtered through what your precious dead mother would have wanted. I couldn't breathe in this house, couldn't exist without being compared to Saint Margaret and found wanting." The honesty was brutal and complete. This wasn't about helping me or protecting Michael or creating a healthy environment. This was about a woman who had always resented playing second fiddle to a mother's love. "So you decided to erase her," Michael said quietly. "I decided to give us a chance to build something that was ours instead of hers." Michael folded the will carefully and handed it back to me. Then he walked to the window that overlooked the lake, the same window where he'd stood as a child, watching for my car to come up the drive after work. "Sadie," he said without turning around, "I want you and your parents out of this house in 1 hour." "Michael!" "1 hour," he repeated. "Take your clothes, your personal items, and nothing else. Everything you removed from this house needs to be returned. Everything you sold needs to be replaced or compensated for, and I never want to see you again." The finality in his voice was absolute. Robert Kellerman started to bluster about legal rights and martial property, but Michael cut him off. "You forged psychological evaluations to have my father declared incompetent. You sold his belongings without permission. You've been living in his house under false pretenses for months. The only legal conversation we need to have is whether criminal charges will be filed." Linda began crying, but they were crocodile tears, performative and calculated. "Michael, honey, you're making a terrible mistake. Families fight sometimes, but you don't throw away a marriage over furniture." "You're right," Michael said, turning around to face all of them. "This isn't about furniture, it's about respect, it's about honesty, it's about understanding that when you marry someone you don't get to erase their history to make yourself more comfortable." He looked directly at Sadie. "I loved you. I would have done anything for you. All you had to do was love me back. All of me, including the parts that were shaped by my parents. Instead, you saw my family as obstacles to overcome." Sadie tried one last manipulation, her voice breaking with practiced vulnerability. "What about our plans? The life we were building? You're throwing it all away for a dead woman's wishes." Michael's response was calm and devastating. "We never had plans, Sadie. You had plans. I was just the means to execute them." An hour later, I watched from the deck as the Kellermans loaded their belongings into 2 cars and drove away. They'd threatened lawyers and lawsuits, but we all knew they had no case. The fake psychological evaluation alone would bury them if they tried to fight this legally. Michael stood beside me, his hands gripping the deck railing so tightly his knuckles were white. "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I let this happen." "You were manipulated by an expert," I said gently. "Don't underestimate how good she was at it." "I should have seen through it. I should have protected Mom's things, protected you." "You were trying to save your marriage. There's no shame in that." We stood in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the lake that had been the backdrop of his childhood. Finally, he spoke again. "What happens now?" "Now we fix it," I said simply. "We get your mother's things back from storage. We find a replacement piano. It won't be the same one, but it'll serve the same purpose. We restore this place to what it was meant to be." "And the will? The inheritance?" I smiled, pulling the document from my pocket one more time. "Michael, there's something I should tell you about this will." He looked at me with concern. "What?" "Your mother never wrote it." His face went blank with confusion. "What do you mean?" "I wrote it last week after Thomas told me about the property searches Sadie had been conducting. The letterhead, the legal language, the notarizations, all perfectly legitimate but created after I discovered what they'd been doing." Michael stared at me for a long moment, then started laughing. It began as a chuckle but grew into full-blown laughter that echoed across the water. "You mean Mom never anticipated this?" "Oh, she anticipated it," I said. "She just never put it in legal writing, but everything in that document reflects what she would have wanted, what she did want. The moral clauses, the emphasis on respecting family history, and that was all her. So technically, Sadie didn't violate any actual will provisions?" "Technically, no. But she violated something much more important: the trust of a family that loved her, the memory of a woman who would have welcomed her, and the heart of a man who deserved better." Michael nodded slowly. "The house is still mine to inherit?" "When the time comes, yes, but Michael, I hope that time is many years away. I hope we have time to fish together again, to barbecue on this deck, to fill this place with better memories. Can we really fix this, Dad? Can we make it right again?" I looked at my son. Really looked at him for the first time in months. He was older now, marked by experience and betrayal, but there was something in his eyes that I hadn't seen since before Sadie. Hope. "Your mother used to say that a house isn't made of wood and stone," I told him. "It's made of love and memory and the people who choose to build their lives there. Sadie tried to steal those things, but she couldn't. They're still here, waiting for us to reclaim them." 3 months later, Margaret's piano was back in its place of honor, restored and tuned to perfection. The walls once again held photographs of our family, our history, our love. Michael had moved back into his childhood bedroom, at least temporarily, while we worked together to heal the wounds Sadie had inflicted. We never heard from her again. The divorce was swift and uncontested. Apparently, a marriage built on deception doesn't leave much to fight over. Michael threw himself into the restoration with the passion of a man making amends, and slowly the house began to feel like home again. On Christmas morning, as snow fell softly on the lake, and Michael played Silent Night on his mother's piano, I felt Margaret's presence in the room as surely as if she were sitting in her favorite chair. We had won more than a house back. We had won our family back. And in the end, that was the only inheritance that truly mattered.